We are live for real now in the studio. Simon Kemp, none other than the real deal, Mr. Digital. He's going to be here on Digital Lives Asia, turning stats into stories with the latest updates on his digital report. Simon, welcome to the show.
Thanks, sir. Good to be back.
It's good to have you here. And you have not only updates from your last quarterly update on the report, but updates since you pushed it out last week.
Absolutely.
Fresh data from yesterday even.
Correct. So the lovely folks at Global Web Index have released some new data into they're basically the free public section. So some of the best data in their data set they make available for free to anybody who wants it. I've been collecting that. And we have the very latest numbers on voice control around
Voice
the world.
control.
So this is
What
voice
is that?
commands, voice search and commands.
Right.
So what we're talking about here is the use of your voice, obviously, to either conduct searches of internet content or to control any kind of app or application or whatever else it may be across your different kinds of devices. So this may be something as obvious as an Amazon Alexa, if you're in the US, right the way through to using your smartphone and being able to just speak commands into that to do whatever it is you're trying to do. I'm really quite staggered at the numbers that are coming out. So as you mentioned, I published that quarterly update just 2 weeks ago. Even though that was just 2 weeks ago, the numbers have changed quite dramatically, and they've got the latest numbers for Q2. So obviously there's a little bit of a delay. Global Web Index surveys millions, literally millions of people all around the world. So it obviously takes a little bit of time to collect that data and bring it all together. They've just published the Q2 numbers for that. And the latest numbers show some pretty sharp increases in voice control over the last few weeks and months. So
Wow. Well, looking forward to digging into that. Just so we can understand, you talked about Amazon, Alexa, Google Home. Would all these come into these? Who's got devices out there at the moment? Who's using voice control?
All sorts of people are using it. So when you're looking at the sort of the developers, if you like, who are weaving this stuff in, then it's available across pretty much every one of your smartphone devices. Right. So obviously you've got things like Siri, got Cortana, you've got Alexa across all smartphones, basically. And that's not just to be asking questions direct into the assistant. You can use that across all sorts of different apps. If you've not tried this already, and I highly recommend it because it's fascinating once you get into it. Try dictating things into your phone using voice. I was absolutely staggered when I started doing research into this a couple of years ago at just how sophisticated the tech has become, and every day it gets better thanks to machine learning. You've then got the stuff like you mentioned, like the smart home, or sort of the smart speakers as they become known, so it's the Apple HomePod or whatever they're calling it. So there's a variety of different devices that now respond to voice. It's becoming more and more popular. And I think that's what I want to be looking at with you today.
All right, great.
It's not just a stat, it's the reasons why the stats are growing.
Right. And before we go into the stats, I like to put a bit of context in. Why is this important right now? Why are we talking about voice right now? Why are all these companies rushing into voice, trying to establish their assistants and sort of win that market?
Yeah, so this is the really sort of important bit of the show, and we'll go into this into a lot of detail over the next, I would imagine, slightly over an hour. We usually manage to talk our way through a long time.
Yeah, we like the sound of our own voice.
We do. And I think there's a good reason for talking about it today as well. So the irony is we're talking on a podcast about voice. But the reason why voice is so important has to do with the next billion. So you've heard of these people before. These are the folks that are coming online for the very first time now all around the world, but particularly in the developing world. They face a number of different challenges when it comes to accessing the internet. And primary amongst those, especially when we're looking at developing nations across Asia, South Asia and Africa, are problems of literacy. So voice becomes a really, really important way for these people to actually access content and their devices. Let me save some of the meat for that as we get into the conversation.
So the next billion, it's not just the next billion though. There must be the first 5 billion or whatever. So how are they, why is voice important to them? Like you and I or your average consumer?
At the moment, it probably doesn't feel like it is because we've kind of developed habits that mean we're quite comfortable doing things by typing or whatever else it is we're doing. But it's not just down to us what we use. And I'll talk you through that as we get into the conversation about the next billion, because when you look at the internet giants, when you look at the Apples, the Amazons, the Facebooks, the Googles of this world, you know, especially based on the most recent earnings announcement from Facebook, if they're not delivering insane growth every quarter, people fall apart. The next billion are the secret to that growth. So they're going to need to win a disproportionate number of those next billion. But in order to maintain their economies of scale and improve their margins, they're going to need all of us to use the same platform. And that's why, because they need to cater to the lowest common denominator in terms of needs, that means they've got to cater to the needs of the next billion And that means that we're all going to have to use those same interfaces first. So it may not feel like voice is something that we're comfortable with yet, especially when we're walking down the street. A lot of Western people feel uncomfortable talking at their phones in public. That's not true in Asia. We'll talk about that as
exactly,
well.
especially in China.
Yeah, there's a cultural aspect to this. There's a tech aspect to this. And as always, we're going to turn all of that into rich stories with anecdotes, but also recommendations.
Excellent. And so if you are interested in voice control and you're interested in the later data, there will be later data, but the latest data, and you want to ask Simon a question or anything that we talk about in the next 50 minutes or hour, then here's how you can do it. There's a couple of ways. Firstly is you can tweet Simon at
Eskimon.
That's Eskimo with an N at the end. You can get him on Twitter, obviously, and you can catch him on the archive if you're watching this, if you want to ask a question about it. If you're following along on YouTube, the best way to catch us, hello everybody, is at atp.show/live. That will be the best way. You can just add a question in the chat box there. Or if you're watching it on the archive, if this is already passed, then you can add a comment, ask a question. So there's a couple of ways you can ask questions because we're going to look at a bit of data today. So it's going to be fast and furious. If you are a data buff, then this next hour is all for you. So let's start at the top. What have you got, Simon? Where do we need to go with this data?
I'm going to start with the growth stat. So over the last 3 months, according to the latest data from Global Web Index, more than 50 million people around the world started using voice control. Started using. So that's pretty damn staggering in my view. But that's not my top stat this week. That's just to give you a context of the fact that this is global. But the key stat is that India, obviously the world's second biggest population, maybe not the world's second biggest population just in terms of internet, still a long way to go before we reach saturation of internet use in India. But amongst Indian internet users, now more than half of internet users are using voice commands every month across their different devices. Now that's pretty staggering. That is really impressive to see that this is the part of the world that is leading the use of voice control. This is cutting edge tech, if you think about it. Now, as I mentioned, there's all sorts of reasons why the developing world is championing the use of voice control, voice tech, and we'll get into that. But yeah, 51% of Indian internet users use voice commands and voice search in the last 30 days.
51% of Indian internet users used voice command or voice search in the last 30 days. That's phenomenal.
It is.
Why India?
So particularly because you've got all sorts of really interesting contextual challenges in India. So there are issues of literacy. I don't just mean the ability to read and write full stop, but the fact that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of languages across India. And the majority of the content on the internet is still in English, which means that it can be a little bit challenging for people who don't know how to sort of write or type or whatever it may be. So the ability to speak instead is a really sort of important development. It makes everything so much more accessible. So even if you're looking at like how to search for a piece of content on YouTube, I think this is the bit that fascinates me most. YouTube is a video platform. No shit, Sherlock, right? But the interesting thing is if you want to find anything on YouTube, you need to either be able to type in a search or you need to be able to click on something that you are able to read. Even though you can see thumbnails, once you get into YouTube, you've got to be able to search to find those thumbnails in the first place. So even to access video-based and audio-visual content, you still need a basic level of literacy to find roughly what it is that you're looking for, unless somebody has sent you a link directly.
Right.
So the ability to search with your voice, which is something that Google in particular is pushing out across all of its different platforms, means that suddenly all of this stuff is so much more accessible to people who are less comfortable. I'm going to use that rather than literacy. So the comfort levels of typing and reading, especially English. So that's one of the reasons why India is sort of championing that sort of world use, if you like. But I want to stress that it's not just about them. So the latest data, I promised you numbers. We're going to nerd out a little bit.
Let's do it.
Top 3 countries. Do you want to guess who the second and thirds are?
So Simon is asking me, what are the top 3 countries in the world for voice command search, right?
Voice search and command.
Voice search and command. Okay. Well, India, I guess. We've already done that. Who else would there be? So I guess it has to be English speaking. No,
this is
he's got to go away. So given what we just talked about with Asia, I mean, China obviously. Every time I see Chinese mobile phone owners walking around, they're shouting at their phones. They're having conversations. So I would say China was one.
Correct.
The third one. Interesting.
It's going to surprise you, I think.
Is it going to surprise me? Okay, so give me a clue. Are they English speaking?
No, not sort of by default.
By default.
There are many people in the country that do speak English.
So it's a big country. Well, it has to be. So it's okay.
It doesn't have to be. No, because this is based on percentages.
Oh, percentage.
Yes, percentages.
So it doesn't have to be. So the third biggest voice search and command usage population in the world. Interesting. I don't know. I'm going to take a guess. I mean, it's going to be something like Brazil, Russia, or Japan. But I don't think it's Japan because of what we talked about before. It could be. Let me see. Well, Who could it be? High. What are the input factors? What makes a high? So different languages in the country are one, right?
They definitely tick that box.
Okay.
Shall I put you out your misery?
Belgium?
There's only really 2 languages that are big in Belgium.
Really?
The answer is Indonesia.
Indonesia.
Which actually comes in second place.
They get a lot of airtime on this show.
They do. And I think if anybody...
Shout out to Indonesia.
Shout out to Indonesia. If anybody's interested in looking at how culture influences digital behaviours, Indonesia is a fascinating sort of microcosm of what's going on. Maybe macrocosm. There's a lot of people in Indonesia. But just the fact that there are so many different languages, there are so many different islands. So when we were looking at things like e-commerce, you've got logistical challenges which are particularly sort of exaggerated in places like Indonesia. But I think what's interesting there, so you've got 3 of the world's biggest countries, but remember this is based on percentages, so the size of the country isn't the sort of the driver of this. But India, 51%, Indonesia, 49%, and China, 48%. Global average 38%, so we've still got a long way to go before this becomes ubiquitous. But as I mentioned, that growth around the world, the fact that it's 50 million people started using it over just the last 3 months alone. And I think it's really important to stress that a lot of people are resisting moving to voice control because, first of all, it feels uncomfortable to do it in public for a lot of people who sort of have grown up in a situation where speaking to yourself is seen as a sign of madness. And then sort of the other bit of it is that we've already developed habits that allow us to do an awful lot of the things that we do online quickly and efficiently. So especially when it comes to searching for information on a platform like Google, most of us are now very sort of, we're used to that habit of going straight into the Google search engine, typing in our request, and then getting a result back pretty quickly. It's a behavior that we do multiple times a day. So the transition to voice control isn't just a case of having access to the technology. It's much more of a psychological and cultural thing as well. So you mentioned the stuff about China. One of the main reasons why China is so comfortable with voice is that Tencent, so WeChat in particular, the main social platform within China, quite a long time ago moved away from typing messages to each other to recording little snippets of audio and sending it. Now, there's a couple of reasons why that's the case. Typing in Mandarin is a bit of a faff. Right, so just being able to input the characters in, it's not like English where you've got straightforward 26 characters. Obviously, to type in the thousands of different characters that you've got in Mandarin takes a few more keystrokes. It's an awful lot faster just to speak it than it is to try and type this stuff in. And why wouldn't you? It's supposed to be a social conversation. To my mind, the model that has been developed by the users of WeChat where they're talking to each other is a much more social way of doing things than what we do with things like WhatsApp, where you and I still texting each other messages saying, I'm going to be late for the show. So I think if you look at what we say this quite often on the Digital Lives Asia show, but what's happening in China at the moment is a pretty good indicator of, I think, the behaviors that we'll be picking up, not necessarily the platforms, but the behaviors that we'll be seeing across global platforms over the next few months.
Interesting. So these conversations that are happening in China, just so people understand, these are not parallel voice conversations, which is just like the phone, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So this is where I send you a voice message, you send me back a voice message. So people are used to that, and you see them walking around, don't you? You see them walking around with the phone, and they're talking at the phone.
They are.
And they've got the phone on full blast in the metro or in the subway.
And we as mainland Chinese people look at that with a degree of cultural confusion. That's me putting this delicately. So if you see that on the streets of London, for example, you'll probably get a lot of local passers-by who feel quite uncomfortable with that level of just noise, because it's just culturally less appropriate to do that in a lot of Western countries or even in Japan. So the idea of speaking loudly in public in Japan would not go down particularly well.
Manner mode.
Just shall not make noise in public. And I think it's really interesting to look at those cultural elements of that. But in terms of the way that Chinese people have developed that, and it's very much like doing this, and then there's the listening to the replies, or there's just, as you said, the full volume aspect of that. So that cultural behavior has developed over a good few years now, and it's just default. You walk around the streets of Beijing, Shanghai, or even a tier 3 city, and people are speaking into their phones. But like you said, it's staccato messages. So in exactly the same way that you and I send text messages and we can wait a few hours between replies if you're in meetings and whatever else, it's the same with the voice thing. So it's there waiting for me when I want to come back and listen to it. It takes a bit of getting used to, because it's a bit sort of, you record your voice and it goes out there and it sort of disappears and you wait for somebody to come back again. But yeah, in my mind, it's an awful lot more straightforward, I suppose, than typing stuff in. The only difference is that it's a bit more difficult to do it in a meeting.
Right.
So it's not perfect for every setting.
And here's what I want to ask you. So you've obviously identified with your data where the main usages are of voice command and search. So we've talked about, for example, like in India, people who, many different types of languages, and there's also the literacy and there's comfort with typing in different languages. And you talked about, for example, with mainland China, where it's actually just a pain in the ass to type in Mandarin, and it's easier just to send a voice message to people, right? So I've used voice, and I've used all different kinds of, I've used like Siri, and I've used Google, and even Amazon Alexa as well. And what I found is that, so, I'm not part of that group that you just mentioned, but I'm sort of the other part, which you mentioned, where it's 38% usage or whatever, is that I have used it and found it very useful, because I can say, like, show me to the nearest MRT station, or show me to the nearest Starbucks, whatever it is, or, list all the World Cup winners since 1966, or whatever, those kind of things. So, and it's interesting, I can show people. However, for some reason, what I find is when I default back to normal life, I'm actually looking for an MRT station, actually looking for a Starbucks or an ATM, I forget to do voice, and I'm back now typing it in. So there must be something going on there where voice command and search is not kind of there. It's not sort of prevalent enough for me to make that my default. So what's going on?
Yeah, it's the default bit. I think you've answered your own question there. I've not got data to back this up, but my understanding based on observation and analysis of trends is that people have developed habits that they're very comfortable with. There's nothing broken, if you like, with those habits. So I can find out where the nearest subway station is without using voice. Yeah. And especially when I'm out and about, if I need to listen to the answer and I don't have a pair of headphones, I'm still aware of the fact that if I have my speaker on loudly in public, I feel a little bit socially uncomfortable with that because of the culture that I grew up in. I think it's just a matter of time. So what's really interesting about the other set of data, so let me just pull up the rest of the stats here. So this is from our Q3 Global Digital Stat Short Report, where we publish data not just by country, but also by age group. The younger you are, the more likely you are to use voice control. Right. Because you've not developed habits of how to do certain things. So 16 to 24-year-olds around the world, I told you the global average was 38, but 16 to 24-year-olds, 45% already using voice control, which is that's pretty decent.
So your point about not developing the habit, because I've had 10 plus years of using, my thumbs to enter a search command.
Yeah. And before that, you were using sort of computers where you were typing stuff in with keyboards anyway. Yeah. So we've become used to this idea that you use a keyboard and type enter information into a device. Whereas if I look at my nieces and nephews who are, a lot younger, shall we say. Yet their whole idea of why would you type? It's so inefficient. So they're sitting there. This is a few years back even. They're sitting there playing with their Legos spread out on the floor. They've got a smartphone next to them, and they're just sort of holding down the little center button and saying, "Hey Siri, tell me about dinosaurs." And Siri then tells them about dinosaurs, and then they ask questions. They're totally comfortable having a conversation with Siri as an interface, instead of what you and I would do. It's like, type it in and tap a link.
But I wonder about that, whether it has sort of a novelty and an entertainment value, and you like showing people, hey, look, what's this? Watch this. Ask Siri this question, right? But when it comes to reality, we kind of default back to this.
We do, because that's what we've got used to. I don't think the younger folks. Okay. I'm making broad generalizations. Again, it varies by culture, it varies by individual. But the less you have a developed way of doing things online, the more likely you are to find the one that is the most efficient for your needs. And I think that's the bit that changing a habit actually is quite inefficient. At the beginning, it's quite painful to sort of force yourself each time to go, I must remember to do that. And yet once you get into the habit of it, let's face it, if you spend a lot of time driving, then voice control is fascinating. It's great because you can do all sorts of stuff without taking your hands off the wheel. You may, it depends on your perspective. You may feel that you're distracted if you are still having a conversation with your phone, but at least it's better than trying to type stuff in. And I think that there's also, whether you're, especially if you look at things like when you're cooking and you've got a recipe. The number of times I've tried to check a recipe when I'm covered in all sorts of nasty ingredients. I don't want to be touching my phone. It would be nice just to go, hey, can you just tell me what the next step is? And the phone then speaks back to you. And I think there are so many opportunities for us to weave that into our lives, but because we've not, after a certain age, you stop being able to learn, old dog and new tricks. There's a danger of that. Whereas younger people and people that are, especially people that are new to the internet, this is why those countries that have a higher proportion of the next billion as their users will feature more highly in use of voice control because they've not developed those habits already. So there's all sorts of stuff playing into this, but based on, again, it's on observation and analysis, and I don't have core data to back this up, but my interpretation of what I'm seeing is that most of this is driven by whether or not you've developed a habit already. And if you haven't, you're far more likely to use voice.
Okay, so there's two interesting input factors, demographics and also economics as well, maybe. I don't know if that would be fair, but you talked about India as an example.
Yeah, so economics is one of the drivers to it. So the ability to afford a smartphone and then have regular data access and stuff like that, unfortunately for a lot of people, is still a significant proportion of their monthly outgoing. So while we may see this as an essential item and therefore we spend a lot of money on it, in a lot of the developing world, this is a significant outlay. We may be talking a couple of months' worth of salary just to be able to afford the device, and then you've got to pay for the ongoing data on top of that. It's not like Wi-Fi is widespread sort of out in the wilds of Senegal, for example.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay, so in that case then, if I was developing a voice app or I was developing some device like a Google Home type device, then in theory it's the countries with the youngest populations that will be those that are most likely or have that input factor at least, right? So Indonesia is an example.
Yeah, but I think it's not so much about building a voice app as such. So all of our devices that we're using as smartphones anywhere in the world are going to have the voice input option.
Right.
It's just a question of whenever you're developing any kind of app that you include the ability to have the voice element in there. So, yeah, I mean, you can use on Android and on Apple devices as a developer, you can include that bit within there. There's a part of the developer kit that allows you to include voice as part of it. So you don't need to be developing a voice specific app. You can obviously if you want to, but I think that technology exists already. So if you have on your phone, so I'm going to open this up right now. If you have on your phone the Google app, whether you're on any kind of device, I suppose. I've lost it. There we go. If you open up the Google device, the Google app specifically, so not just your Chrome, but if you open it up, so I'm going to show this.
Yeah.
Oh, it's a bit bright. But you notice there on the screen at the very end of the type-in bar, there's a big microphone symbol. Yep. So it's core to what Google is trying to do.
I want to put this to the test. I want to ask it about which countries in the world have the youngest populations. Okay. Because if you've got a talking point, because if Indonesia's in that would be interesting based on what we said. So I'm going to try this live.
Shall I do it? Do you want to do it?
Well, I'll do it.
You do it. Steal your thunder.
Hello, Google. Are you going to talk back to me? Oh, if I type in it.
Matching video.
Oh.
I don't want a matching video. All right. So, Google, tell me. I want to know which countries in the world have the youngest populations. Oh, he's not going to speak back to me. But these maps show where the world's youngest and oldest people live.
And you did that just by using your voice.
Yeah, there you go.
So I'm going to see if it'll do it for me.
All right.
Okay, Google. Which countries have the youngest populations?
I found 30 on World Atlas. Here are the first three: Niger, Uganda, and Chad.
There you go.
And an email to finish. That's fascinating. So Niger, Uganda, and Chad.
Chad. I've got a list here. I've got a map.
So just to be clear, I don't have data for those countries in my sample.
No.
But nonetheless.
Well, let's put it in the context of Asia. So what I'll do is I'll ping this link to my man Barrett, and he'll bring this up on the screen live. Barrett. How about that?
Barrett is discreetly behind the scenes in the studio with us.
So I'll talk through this. So Barrett, if you can maybe get this map up, we can have a look at. There you go. Well done. How fast was that? So if you scroll down, Barrett, scroll down, and then we will have a look at that. There we go. So keep scrolling down. Yeah, there's the world map, which shows like the youth population. Keep going down, all the way down, and you get to Asia. Keep going. Keep going.
Keep going.
It's about keep going. Europe, Africa. Yeah, we're not interested in these, Middle East, South. Yeah, next one. Here we go.
Asia Pacific.
So this is interesting. So what we have here is a map of median ages. I'm not going to say average ages because some will get cross.
Talk about
all right.
Again.
So what this says is this is where you want to find the biggest youth populations in theory as a percentage, right? In theory, roughly. So you've got here the green and the yellow and the orangey ones are the youngest ones, right? So you have India, 27 years is the median, and then compare that, for example, with Japan, which is like one of the oldest populations. It's 46.1. That would tell us that in this case, I mean, in the instance of voice command and search, these have a lot of old people who maybe are set in their ways, as you say, like they're more difficult to learn, so they're less likely to adopt things, new ways of doing search, new ways of doing everyday mundane things, right?
Yeah, things that you've, whether it's mundane or not, but just things that you've kind of got used to. What's really interesting is Japan is second bottom on my list now.
There you go.
Hasten to add, I've only got data for 40 countries around the world here, but they're 40 of the world's biggest economies and they account for more than 70% of the world's internet users. But Japan, 16%. Interestingly, though, at the same levels of usage, Belgium, Austria, Germany and Sweden. The lowest on my list is the Netherlands, although I think that may be an anomaly based on the data that I got for the previous quarter.
But they're quite an old population, all those sort of European populations. And they've also been quite established in terms of, what I'm trying to say is that they're sort of saturated mobile markets. They're not new to mobile.
Correct.
So there's lots of old people who've been using mobile for 15, 20 years. Well, I'm one of them, so 20 years.
Japan, you've got I think across a lot of those countries, you've not just got an age issue, you've got a cultural issue. So a lot of these countries are the ones that also rank highest for privacy. So places like Germany and the Netherlands always come quite high up the list of people who worry about how their data will be used online. And I think a lot of people concerned that having the microphone on their phone on at all times may result in Google recording all of their conversations. Let's face it, folks, if Google is monitoring the conversations of 3 billion plus users of Android, nobody's sitting down listening to that. There is simply not enough people in the world to be able to listen to all of those conversations at the same time. Now, yes, there are algorithms that can help do that, and there are certainly concerns about some people's conversations being monitored, which is a massive human rights issue. But at the same time, if you are a normal person going about your business and you're asking Google where the cheapest pint is in your neighborhood, it's unlikely that somebody's sitting and listening into those conversations. So I think a lot of the time the media loves to exaggerate the fears of these potential issues. But yeah, I think, it will come back to the fact that if I'm going to be looking for where I can find the cheapest pint in my neighborhood, I'm probably going to type it in, even though I'm an advocate of all of this.
Can you actually does it have that kind of specificity?
Yes, in cities like London, you can quite happily. So actually, do you know one of the best things about this? I was with my wife driving around Canada recently.
Wait, Google.
I don't know if it'll do it in Singapore, but let's see.
Do you think it's going to work?
Well, I was just going to say, when we were driving around Canada, my wife would regularly ask Google where the cheapest petrol was.
Right.
And it would find...
Gasoline.
Actually, they still call it petrol in Canada.
Oh, yeah. Canada's kind of like Canada. Still doing the OU thing, isn't it?
So, she would ask, where's the cheapest petrol around here? And it would find within 20 kilometres where the cheapest petrol was.
Can I put it to the test?
You can.
All right.
Cheapest pint.
Cheapest beer. Google, hello. Are you speaking to me? Okay, I haven't even got to that stage. All right. So, Google, where is the cheapest beer near here?
Here are the listings for the cheapest beer near here within 7 kilometres.
Wow.
Well, there you go. Thank you very much.
It's not going to read them out, unfortunately.
No.
But we need to check that we've not got listeners under the age of 18 before we talk about that anyway, so it's all right.
There you go.
Even knows that it's a sensitive topic.
Interesting.
It is great, isn't it?
Yeah.
The thing is, you can type that in as well, but once you start using voice control, what's really interesting is that the kinds of queries that you use change dramatically.
This is what I'm interested in, because that's no different than just Googling, right?
Correct.
But what is the context of voice search?
So the way that you asked that question right there, it was interesting. You said, hello, Google, and you started doing stuff. What's really interesting, if you typed that in, you probably would have said cheap beer.
Yeah.
Or even just cheap beer and typed it in, right? And you would have hoped, and then you might have gone, no, it's not near here, and then you would have typed it in again. We are much more likely to use natural language queries when we're using voice. Now, that's a statement of the obvious when you think about it, but from an SEO perspective, if you're a marketer, if you're a small business that wants to improve the visibility of your listings in a Google ranking, you've built that around keywords. But the keywords that we use when we use voice control are often quite different. So cheap beer near here is a really interesting query. Would you have normally done that, or would you have said pubs near here?
Yeah.
right? And I think it's the way that we start doing things differently once we start speaking to our devices like it's another human being. Now, I have two theories on this. One of them is that we start treating our devices like a person, which I think a lot of us that are older...
I kind of was there. Hello, Google.
Exactly. A lot of us feel slightly weird doing that, but
Yeah.
younger folks don't. So, like I was saying, my niece and nephew have conversations with Siri.
Mm.
The alternative is that we were only doing that because we're not used to the technology yet, and we will develop more sort of streamlined ways of using the technology over time. So if you think about the very first time you used Google back in the 90s, you probably typed in a question. Like full question, where?
Yeah.
I've actually discovered, since I started using voice control, I started using natural language when I'm typing as well, because I find the results from natural language questions more focused on what I want. Because I got to the stage where I just type in one word, like I just go beer, and hope that it would know.
And not even spell it properly, just let Google work it out.
Into it, right? Typical drunken activities. But I think it's really interesting when you look at that. Over time, people develop different habits. It comes back to habits again, which I think is really interesting. The technology gets more and more sophisticated, and yet we default to less sort of, lowest common denominator activities wherever possible. We dumb down because it's faster to get to where we want to get to. So, there's a whole rabbit hole of different stuff that we want to be talking about here. So the kinds of queries that people use result in different kinds of results coming back. But I was going to save this until later, but I have a funny feeling this is probably going to be the rest of the show talking about exactly this anyway. So let me bring it up as the main theme now. Where I'm taking this conversation with my clients at the moment, so along with collecting lots of data, I do actually do some consulting work with clients as well. And speaking to an awful lot of senior marketers around the world at the moment, the question that we're looking at is, what does this mean for things like e-commerce? So we mentioned Amazon Alexa, and... He's using all sorts of voice stuff in the background, folks. When you start looking at the way that people use voice control to order their shopping, that also defaults to natural language activities. So if I was to talk to you about, suppose we were going to organize an event for Friday afternoon with the team here. If you were going to pick up the phone to me and say, hey, Simon, on your way over to the studio, could you pick up beer, chips and ice cream? That's a normal conversation. I would be really freaked out if you said, hey Simon, can you pick up Heineken, Lay's and Ben and Jerry's? Because it's so specific. It's not how normal people talk about most categories. We may have a very specific preference for a particular category in a particular context, but that's the exception, not the rule. The funny thing is, when we start ordering our groceries in particular on voice controlled e-commerce platforms, we use those natural language processing. So, hey Alexa, add beer, chips and ice cream to my cart. What happens if I don't specify a brand? How does Alexa decide?
Who decides? There you go.
This is where the magic comes in. And you've got a few different ways that this may happen, and none of these have become the de facto way of doing this yet. It might be that the platform asks us. So it says, okay, Graham, which brand of beer would you like? But that's really bad UX, because if I'm ordering 70 different items in my groceries, I don't want the platform to be asking me for every single one. So it might default to the ones that I usually buy. I might just have a standard cart, because most of the groceries that we buy each week are exactly the same as the week before. I get 2 liters of milk, I get X, so things that I buy by default each week. And I could just say, okay, Alexa, send me my weekly groceries. And it knows that there's a default that I get every week. And it just keeps coming nice and easy. So that's option number 2. It could do the thing that Amazon does really well at the moment. And it's not just Amazon, obviously. There's lots of other platforms that do this too. But it looks at what other people like you have bought. So it says 63% of your friends prefer, Tiger over Heineken, for example. And I go, well, that's great. Add Tiger to my cart. But in reality, we know that there's going to be algorithms at play behind this, where if we don't specify a brand, we have clicked something somewhere that says, I am happy for the platform to choose for me. This is where I get really excited. How does it decide that? What inputs does it use? It could be pay to play. So it could be that brands bid. That's the way that retail works at the moment. And I think a lot of people miss this out. So just a conversation earlier this week with a client. If you look at the way that shelf space at the world's biggest supermarkets gets decided, it's still defined by the amount of money people are spending on broadcast advertising, especially TV. So you go into your average Carrefour, Walmart, you name it, the brand that has the most prominent shelf space has most likely invested huge amounts of money in TV advertising, even though none of the people that buy that brand or product are watching TV.
That would be your Procter & Gamble. and your Unilevers.
Yep. So those kinds of brands, even like down to things like Campbell's Soup and whatever else, if they've got national TV advertising on, they will get more prominent placement on the shelf. And you will have the buying team at the supermarket that says, unless you've got that on air right now, you will not get prominent placement. Now, that's a massive, massive investment for a lot of these brands. And most of that investment is simply to get good shelf space, because regardless of how good your advertising is, once you get to the shelf, if there's a good offer on, you're going to be quite happily swayed at the shelf. So the prominent position, this idea of pay to play to be prominent on the shelf, is something that most brands are absolutely fine with. So paying a voice controlled e-commerce platform to be the default option is exactly the same as buying huge amounts of TV advertising to be the default option.
Right.
It's just you being a bit more direct about it.
Can we put this to the test and just sort of set this out as an example, and then think about what this will look like as a pay to play bidding for voice searches?
Yeah. So you may find it difficult to do that in Singapore at the moment. If you're in the UK or in the US, it's a lot more straightforward to say add beer to my cart and then see what happens.
Okay, well, maybe not beer. Let's not do beer. Let's pick something else which people will be buying. And, let's think about... I mean, for example, like... if it's going to be like a concierge type service, right, which is kind of getting to, I mean, then you could book anything or buy anything. So, for example, like, I'd like to go on vacation. Where should I go?
Oh, totally.
Well, let me just type that in or say it. There you go. Hey, Google, I'd like to go on vacation. Where should I go? Oh, I had the voice turned off. But
got habits to develop.
Yeah, there you go. Sorry, we were on air. That's why. But so it's just come up with this list here, which you can just sort of see. But that could have been bid if somebody just said that. I mean, they are bidding ads now anyway, right? So at the top ads are people bidding for that. Correct. So why not have that in the responses as well? It
already works that way. So if you are buying keywords on Google today to get one of those ad listings at the top of the search results, people will be bidding on the word vacation, and that's one of the world's most expensive keywords for obvious reasons. People spend a huge amount of money on vacation, so it's a valuable keyword. There's absolutely nothing different about how voice works.
Right. It's just a little bit more complicated, isn't it? Because
not necessarily, because Google will translate your spoken commands into the same sort of data inputs. Right. It's not translating it into text, remember, because text gets translated into another kind of data input as well. So it's bits, ones and zeros it gets translated into, and then that then powers the algorithm behind the scenes. So whether it's voice, whether it's image, whatever it may be, it translates it into an input. It then goes into the system, triggers a keyword alert, and off we go. But I think what's really interesting is that would you have typed that in? You could do exactly the same thing by typing. I think this is what's really interesting, is that the process that you're going through in your mind at the moment is the same as almost everybody goes through when they first start using voice. You could do that quite happily, typing the same queries into Google today, but we don't do that.
Right, so why would I do it like that? Why would I do it in the context of voice instead of typing it?
I don't know. My suspicion is that when we use voice, it activates a very different part of our brains to when we're thinking and typing, because thinking and typing, it's a very sort of passive kind of, not passive, it's a very focused kind of activity. Whereas when we're doing things with voice, we tend to be in a slightly more, it's not creative, I don't know what the word is, but we use a very different part of our, we're becoming sociable, first of all. So we're asking for recommendations in a very different kind of way. So if I was to ask you, where's a good place to go for lunch around here? It'll be a very different sort of set of expectations to if I go into my sort of typed search and I say lunch near here.
Do you think it's something to do with the fact that with other people, would that have an impact? Because it's obviously contextual. What you're identifying is that we're using different parts of our brain, and we're going to search for different things and in different ways using voice command than we are just typing it in. And it's not going to be one or the other. We're going to do this for this occasion and we're going to use voice for that occasion, right?
Potentially, yeah.
So what would it be? I wonder if it's when you're with people, maybe... That's where
element
I don't know.
My suspicion is part of its novelty. Because we're just not used to using it, then we're trying it out to see what it would do. I mean, let's face it, choosing where to go on vacation is a real stress point for a lot of people. You end up stressing yourself out so much by booking the holiday that you need the holiday to then relieve the stress. So if you can find a solution that really did say to you, based on all of your other activities, I would recommend that you go to the Cayman Islands and spend 2 weeks sitting on the beach, and you're like, wow, I'd never thought of the Cayman Islands. It's exactly that kind of thing that I think we'll be trying out when we first use voice control for things beyond just the novelty value. We'll actually go, does this provide a better solution? Now, I've been using voice control for a few different things, whether it's searching, but also for dictating. So I'm pretending to write a book at the moment. I say pretending because I'm useless at staying focused for long enough to do it. But rather than actually typing that, I've been dictating a lot of it because it allows me to... I don't know whether this is the same for you, but when I'm typing something, I'll find I write a sentence and then I'll rewrite it in a different way and I'll just go backwards and forwards. Whereas when I'm dictating something, I have a very different workflow. So I just say all my ideas, say the same idea a few different ways, but don't delete it. So I'll just say the same thing again a few different times. And it actually captures an awful lot of my thinking a lot better than typing it does. So it's a really useful way of sort of having everything there as an ingredient that I can come back and cook with later. So whether it's search, whether it's voice commands, whether it's doing something like making a booking or whatever else it is. I don't know whether you saw recently when Google had its recent sort of developer day and they were showing the assistant that helps you book the haircut. So listeners and viewers, if you've not seen this, just do a search for Google Assistant haircut booking. I'm sure that do it as a voice search and see whether that comes up. But I think it's absolutely fascinating when you look at the ability for the machines now not only to understand what we're saying, but then to respond in natural human-sounding language, complete with the the sort of conversational noises and pauses like the ums and whatever else. The ability to have a conversation with a device is going to happen. I'm going to be confident about this. Within the next 3 years, we're going to be able to have a relatively straightforward conversation and it feel very, very natural. Now, if we're going to get nerdy about this, artificial intelligence, the Turing test is when you have a conversation with a device and you don't realize that it's not a human. I think we're so close to that.
Right. I have some ideas on that. Maybe we can have a look at that particular Google video that you're talking about, just so we can put this into context, because this was fascinating, wasn't it?
It was.
Barrett, I've just pinged you this. Maybe we can get this up. So this was Developer Day for Google, and what it was is, I mean, the depth of the reality in terms of how sort of believable it was just phenomenal, right?
Yeah.
So, okay, so...
I think a lot of people got freaked out about how believable it was, and that really interested me, is that most of the conversations were around the fact that, I don't like this.
Yeah, exactly. That was it, because it was too human. It was a bit creepy, wasn't it?
Yeah. You had a lot of people say the same thing when cars came out. I don't like this. And now
or even answering machines.
Yeah. It's really interesting how we react to things that sort of change what we've become used to.
Yeah.
I think this is one of the biggest challenge to technical progress is the layperson getting freaked out about it.
Yeah. Well, this was a good example. So Barrett, if you can just kind of get that up on the screen, not this one. If you go to
we're having some technical challenges.
Type in this Google. What was it? What was the time? What was the search term that you just used? Google. Google haircut assistant call.
Yeah.
That'll get it. Google haircut assistant call. Let's get that up. Now, this is sort of a good example of how sort of advanced natural language processing has become.
Yeah.
Right. And I've used, so you've got two things. You've got one, on the one hand, what's going on is bringing in my AI background here, is that you've got the audio recognition, which is like, if you go to, there's apps like Otter. I don't know if you've seen Otter.ai, which is phenomenal. It's the one in the middle there. It's the one, if you look at those 3 videos there, the one on the left-hand side, Google, that's it. Click that. So maybe we can have a look at that.
So, Sundar Pichai talking about...
All right, but we're not going to actually get the audio up, are we? There you go.
So, viewers and listeners, you want to be doing the same search that we just did there.
This is the one. Okay, we can talk over it. So basically, he makes this call. So you've got the audio recognition, which is basically actually being able to identify the words. And if you look at Otter as an example now, Otter.ai, it just shows you how advanced that is.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, you have the natural language processing, which is pattern recognition, which is understanding that, okay, if I say these certain things, it means X, right? And therefore, Y is a potential outcome, which is where you bring in the AI, right? So there's two things going on, and Google have really nailed it with this. And they've got it to its stage where you can basically have a real conversation and fake it on the person on the other side within confined parameters. And I guess that's where I want to come in with, within confined parameters. When you're booking something, yes. But, that whole idea of the Turing test, I couldn't have a conversation necessarily with that person about philosophy. Right.
You think?
Yeah, and I'll tell you why in a minute. At this level of processing, that's where we are. I don't know if you can get the voice, the actual audio up at the moment.
I'll see if I can load it up on my phone as we go.
Yeah.
But I'm interested. I think you brought up philosophy in there.
Yeah.
Our vision for our system
Excellent.
is to help you get things done. It turns out gets done is making a phone call. You may want to get an oil change schedule, maybe call a plumber in the middle of the week, or even schedule a haircut appointment. We think AI can help with this problem. So let's go back to this example. Let's say you want to ask Google to make you a haircut appointment on Tuesday between 10 and noon. What happens is the Google Assistant makes the call seamlessly in the background for you. So what you're going to hear is the Google Assistant actually calling a real salon to schedule the appointment for you. Let's listen.
How can I help you? Hi, I'm calling to book a women's haircut for a client. I'm looking for something on May 3rd. Sure, give me 1 second.
I love that.
That's the robot talking
Sure,
there.
what time are you looking for around? At 12 p.m. We do not have a 12 p.m. available. The closest we have to that is a 1:15. Do you have anything between 10 a.m. and 12 p.m.? Depending on what service she would like. What service is she looking for? Just a woman's haircut for now? Okay, we have it 10 o'clock. 10 a.m. is fine. Okay, what's her first name? The first name is Lisa. Okay, perfect. So I will see Lisa at 10 o'clock on May 3rd. Okay, great. Thanks. Great. Have a great day. Bye.
It's just amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, it's difficult to distinguish who is who.
Yeah.
Maybe what happens if it was like two Google Assistants talking to each other? How about that?
with music in the background. Nicely done. Thanks, Barrett. That was a good bit of improvisation there. Yeah, I find it fascinating. There are bits of it when you can tell that the intonation went a little bit
really
uncomfortable. So
Right.
the very first time when she mentioned 12 p.m., the intonation
yeah.
went down instead of...
But you wouldn't have caught that unless you were looking for it, right?
Correct. I mean, you might have just kind of gone, she's doing other stuff while she's talking to me.
Yeah.
I
Well, she
wouldn't have
sounds a bit
suspected it was a
robotic, this woman.
machine. See, she doesn't sound robotic. That's what blows me away. When
Yeah.
she's got the...
Yeah.
It's fascinating. Now, this is a relatively, like you said, it's a relatively sort of process-driven conversation, even for a human. It's like
Right.
you've
There's
got
a goal.
You've got a very clear goal. It's a fairly straightforward conversation. If you were to get into something like philosophy, but here's the thing, right? I have a lot of conversations with clients around the world about artificial intelligence at the moment, where I talk about empathy, and people are like, "Oh, there's no way that machines will be truly creative and truly empathetic," and I'm afraid that's complete nonsense. We are fooling ourselves if we believe that humans are in some way superior when it comes to the way that our brains work, because our brains are powered by electrical pulses. And ultimately, this is just a question of things that we've learned.
It's a quantitative difference, not a qualitative one, right? So, like the reason we're superior is just sheerly processing power. It doesn't mean we'll never be superior.
And I think
in future.
It's partly the fact is that most of what we do is based on experience, either as an individual or the hive mind. So things we've learned as a species over time, and it's all learning, which is machine learning. Now, saying that machines can't do it, I'm going to add an important word. They can't do it yet. But empathy, if you look at empathy around the world, it's very different from culture to culture. The way that people respond to very emotional situations varies dramatically between cultures. If that happens, if that's the case, then empathy is largely learned. There are gut instincts that we have which may control that, but those are simply chemical reactions in the body which are again driven by electrical pulses.
Right. I would add that empathy is learning rather than is learnt. Right.
Oh, I like that.
And the reason why I say
that.
this is that definitely. Go for it. So the scientists have discovered a part of the brain, and it's called the mirror neuron.
Yes.
Right. And the mirror neuron basically is, they didn't know why it existed, but they discovered it when they first put this monkey in this lab, and they sat the monkey opposite, this sort of screen where they observe people, and basically what happened is the monkey was wired up. And, if, like they always are, unfortunately, but so the professor walked in and had a look at the monkey, and nothing was happening to the monkey. He was just sitting there watching, eating, as they do. And then the professor started eating his lunch, and the monkey was eating his lunch as well. And whilst they were both doing the same activity, there was a part of the brain that was firing this positive response, and they didn't know why it was. It was an Italian professor, and he kept sort of looking into it. Why is it that every time I do something, the monkey does the same thing? It creates this positive trigger in the brain of the monkey. And they discovered this group of neurons in the monkey it's called the mirror neurons. It's at the frontal cortex. And because it's at the frontal cortex, it's most associated or closest to emotion and language. They've now discovered that human beings have very, very dense clusters of mirror neurons, right? Which basically means that they're there for a reason. They're not
that's not an
evolutionary echoes, if you like. And what they've discovered is actually these mirror neurons are the reason why we learn language and the reason why we're social. And the reason is because we are social, hardwired by design. So if we copy what somebody does in many different ways, then it creates a positive reinforcement. So when the baby's born and it sees a behavior and copies it, or when it's a toddler, it gets positively reinforced. And this is like the root of language. It's the root of like social behavior and all kinds of like those sort of, you talk about the hive mind and stuff like that. So empathy is learning, and it is hardwired into the brain. So that's core to language as well. So bringing it back to the whole sort of like the machine thing as well. We can learn that if we just have machines copy. They can learn. They can be empathic. It's just a processing thing, isn't it? It's like one of the things they've just discovered. I mean, they've discovered in recent years with the brain. Is that we've modeled the brain on computers and modeled the computer on the brain, right?
I didn't even notice that was the wrong way around.
So and what's sort of the problem with that model is that it's sort of like an electrical circuit model, which is like ones and zeros, right? It's a binary yes or no.
Yeah.
When in reality the brain is like yes, no, maybe, and like the circuits are like 70-80% maybes.
Yeah.
But our computers are built like yes and no.
Yeah.
So to your point, like how can we create something as amazing as that sort of conversation where they can actually have a conversation and understand and empathize and learn and feel, oh, this person's busy, therefore I won't take up their time. And how does a computer know that?
Yeah.
Surely it's a processing thing. Like, if we're at level 100, it needs to be at level 1,000,000 before they can do that. So, sorry, just to answer your point, like, I do believe that human beings are vastly superior to computers, but it's just a matter of time.
It's a matter of time. And I think when we look at how we learn as toddlers, exactly like you were saying, and most of that learning is by copying. Now, eventually we get to the stage where we question things and we find our own ways of doing stuff. But the vast, vast, vast majority of the stuff that we do in life is learnt from other people and is copied in large part. And that is the absolutely most efficient way of doing things, because we're talking about language. We don't want to be inventing languages for every individual person. That's just ridiculous, right? It's one of those shared things. Now, obviously, we have developed lots of different languages in cultures around the world based on our own tribes and whatever else. But increasingly, we're losing some of those languages. Now, from a cultural perspective, that's incredibly sad. But from an efficiency perspective, you can totally understand why that would happen. If I am one of only 10 people that speak a language, it's an incredibly restrictive kind of world to live in, given that there are billions of people that I might want to talk to now. When you look at, I think one of the things you said there was really interesting as well, is the idea that we've modeled a lot of AI and machine learning systems on the human brain. I think that's where we're going wrong, especially when we get into the creativity side of things. We are building on what we know, I get that, but the danger is that we're always going to compare it back to ourselves. At best, we're going to have something that replicates ourselves and then does it slightly better. So if you look at the most sort of talked about examples of AI, where we've got a machine that beat us at Go, or we've got machine learning algorithms that are learning how to do driverless cars, they're just doing what people can do already. And that's great. I would love to have a driverless car so that I can look out the window and enjoy the scenery. But that isn't going to exponentially change progress. If you develop a system that does things that humans cannot do, if it is focused on sort of tackling challenges that we have no idea how to address, all of a sudden it's going to get a lot more interesting, because humans can do these things better already. That's the problem. It's going to take a while for human replicant systems to catch up with humans themselves. So why not task it? One of the things that fascinates me most at the moment is creativity. So when we task an AI system to come up with something creative, sadly, an awful lot of the time it's come up with an advert video for something. And it's amazing, because we give people the outputs from the creative process and they judge it based on very human terms. And the funny thing is that because they know it's come from an AI system, they don't think it's creative. Yeah. And yet I say, give me a Jackson Pollock canvas where the man has, I love Jackson Pollock, don't get me wrong, but the man has squiggled paint. Who decided that was creative?
But then, okay, so isn't it the fact that it's the story told about that canvas
and
that makes it.
Is what is creative.
So, I mean, a good example. Well, here's the thing. A good example is you like cooking, right? You like food. You know, if you were to write a cookbook, I'm pretty much guarantee it's already been written.
Oh, yeah.
Like, I mean, it's all about the story. I mean, people buy cookbooks and they don't ever cook anything out of them, right? Because it's just that story that's told about the cookbook, right?
Yep.
And the fact that you actually have a cookbook is almost secondary to the fact you bought into the story.
Yep. And you're telling yourself a story by buying them as well.
Yes.
Everything's stories.
So that's the part which I think, again, maybe it's just a matter of scale, you know, bringing it back to language, is that, you know, the computers right now are nowhere near that.
No.
And creativity and music, and another example, right?
Music, not so. So if you look at the AI systems, so JukeDeck.com, fascinating example of this. Now, it's replicating human creativity, but JukeDeck.com,
right.
You can go in there and you can say, I want a 3-minute piece of music.
Can we have a look at that? Can you get up there?
So Bharat's doing us. He's all sorts of skills behind the scenes today.
No, he's real. He's not.
If you say to it, I want a 3-minute piece of music in a drum and bass style that is uplifting, it will create a new piece of music. And, you know...
is it a new piece of music, though?
Is any piece of music new?
Oh, there you go. Well, that is creativity, though, isn't it? It's
you look at the charts today, none of it's new. It's all the same shit.
Right, but then how... I mean, if you take somebody like... if you take somebody like... Let's take Marshmello as an example, only because, like, I hear it every day in my house next to my son, is that what makes him successful and not anything that comes out of Duke Deck?
It comes back to exactly what you said, stories.
Right.
If you look at a lot of the people that are the most renowned musicians of our day, are they the world's best musicians? Absolutely not.
Yeah.
They are.
No, not at all.
Usually very attractive people who are very good show people who get up on a stage and deliver an experience that we share with others.
Right.
If I think back to the tunes that defined my teenage years were not the tunes that I liked the best. They were the ones that defined the summer when I was on holiday and I got together with that girl. And, you know, most creativity is about the story that goes with it, exactly as you said. So sadly, an awful lot of the world's most creative people, you look at somebody like Monet and the beautiful paintings and the artistic movement that went with Impressionism, died impoverished.
Yeah.
And yet his paintings go for how much now?
Yeah.
Millions
we
and
didn't
millions,
tell a
right?
good story, whereas Picasso did, right?
Right. Was it because he didn't tell a story because the story didn't resonate at the time, but now it resonates a lot better? And I think this is... we're going to stray into dangerous territory if we start talking about the world's best storytellers. But if you look at the reason why Trump is such a phenomenon at the moment, regardless of what you think of him and his policies, he is one of the world's best showmen.
Yeah. Storyteller.
Right. And this is it, right?
Yeah.
So I love the way that we got here from voice control, but I think that this is it, is that...
I think that's related, because voice control, I mean, what we're trying to do is, like, we're pushing in a direction. We said, look, what lies next in voice control? Is it this sort of concierge type assistant which knows us better than ourselves and is able to take away all this sort of heavy lifting in our lives, you know, and behaves like an individual? Like, and we saw in that Google example, right? We saw that example of somebody who speaks like a human being. Is that where we... Technically, can we go there? And philosophically, do we want to go there?
Technically, we can go there already. Whether the general public is ready for that is a very different question.
And then we also asked, like, you know, does that also mean all this sort of creative stuff could be taken up by this same technology, like music and art and so on? So within the context of voice control, you think technically we're there?
Oh, totally. So if I wanted to right now, I could very easily just get Alexa to deliver me the same set of 70 groceries every week.
Right.
I don't need to make any further decisions in my life about which laundry detergent to use. I just do not have any emotional capacity left to give a shit about which one I buy.
Do you think as well is that there's this thing called decision fatigue, which is real?
Absolutely.
Which is why Barack Obama apparently had 2 boiled eggs every morning.
Right.
That's it.
Every day.
And then it was asked why, and he said, well, you know, do you want the guy who's got the finger on the button to make a decision
about what happened? It's the
what
same.
For breakfast?
Zuckerberg makes the same thing about his wardrobe.
Oh, his hoodie, yeah. So do you think we're facing more decision fatigue?
Yeah.
Therefore, we need these decision bots to work for us?
Yes, so you look at 200 years ago, we didn't have to make as many decisions as we do today because we didn't have as many choices as we do today.
Right.
Our worlds were, you know, geographically much smaller. We had far fewer stimuli. Now we're overwhelmed with stuff all the time.
Yeah.
And most of our brain is now sort of occupied with filtering.
Yeah.
That's the reason why we see thousands of commercial images every day and yet we remember none of them most of the time. Delegating the less valuable decisions to a system that knows me better than I know myself. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that. So already Facebook knows me better than I know myself. It's able to predict what I will do with better accuracy than I will be able to predict myself, just based on a few hundred likes that I've clicked on over the last few years. So a system that has access to that basic data will be able to make better decisions than I will, because, I'm swayed by all sorts of very foolish things in life. And with no disrespect to Apple, this is a technically inferior device that I have bought because it tells a story to me and to other people about who I am. Now, I am aware that I have spent money on what is effectively just a glamour object here. A large part of the profit that Apple makes is because
you spent money on the story.
I did. The story I tell myself a lot of the time.
Yeah.
It's not even like to the rest of the world. And
But it's not vapor, is it? And there's a lot in it.
Yeah, and, this comes back to an awful lot of statements that, confidence that allows you to procreate or succeed or whatever else. Helps
you procreate, maybe.
Right. If you listen to Professor Scott Galloway from NYU Stern, one of my sort of go-to references for anything to do with marketing, an awful lot of what he talks about is the choices that we make boil down to the most basic human sort of function. Maslow's hierarchy.
Otherwise we're just complicating things. At the end of the day,
it comes down to
it's the 4 Fs.
Will I survive? Will I procreate? All the usual, right? And it's remarkable how often things that we try and make into incredibly elaborate decisions are actually very lizard brain, amygdala stuff.
I'm thinking about the decision stuff fascinates me, and this is sort of it creates this need for voice control and voice search and these sort of concierge type services. And you think about it, like the human brain, there's a part of the human brain which effectively gates out stimuli, right? Because like you say, we get thousands of marketing messages thrown at us on a daily basis. Yep. We can't function. So we have to gate out 95%. And it's why, for example, like a driver in a car will hit a cyclist because they didn't see them, even though they saw them.
All that for something else,
Yeah, exactly. Even though it was there in plain sight. And the issue is that we've become very good at gating out marketing messages and media and everything in our world now, but those guys, the marketers with Simon's data, for example, have become very good at getting our attention, right? So that's the challenge. It's like an evolutionary arms race of attention. Yeah. So they're very good at getting in our face and it's all these different tactics to getting our attention. Therefore, we can never kind of get away from the fact there's more and more stuff wanting our attention.
Yeah.
So we need something to sit in between us and them to help filter that, because it's just getting to a stage where we're overloaded. Like, if I'm talking to you, I'm also looking at my phone and, we're trying to have a conversation and we've got the laptop here and you go down to the hawker center or you go down to a restaurant these days and you see families sitting around the table and there's 4 of them and they're all looking at their phones.
Right. But one of the interesting things is that a lot of those families are actually sharing videos backwards and forwards that they're then watching on their own individual devices. So whereas we used to sit around and stare at a big screen together and not talk, we're now all of us watching the same thing.
Do you think they are?
A lot of the time.
I'm not sure. I see people, what I tell you, one thing I do see is like a young girl and a mom and they're eating together and the young girl is like watching her tablet or her phone and she's like listening on earphones. So she's obviously just shut off from mom, but that's nothing new. But the point is that, this attention thing is a real issue. So
it is. And I think a question then becomes, is this inherently bad or is it just different to what you and I know? And it's very easy for us. The older we get, the easier it is to dismiss the new as a bad thing. Is interacting with somebody online massively inferior? Now, obviously, you're missing an awful lot of social cues by interacting online, but is that social interaction less valuable? If I talk to 300 people a day that are spread around the world, is that less valuable or just different to speaking to the same 5 people in person every day? Personally, I get more reward out of human-to-human interactions. There's a reason why you and I are in the studio now and not doing this remotely, is that we get richer conversations by being face-to-face. But I wonder whether it's just because that's what we're used to, and over time the human race will evolve.
A billion years, or a million years, however it is, of Homo sapiens. Yeah.
Right. It's taken time for us to get to where we are, and the fact that it's taken a million years to get here and we've had 20 years of the internet, I don't expect Maslow's hierarchy needs to change overnight. It's not.
We're not. I mean, our brain isn't designed for this media landscape, and it isn't adapting to it fast enough to deal with it. No. So this is why I find it fascinating. The data that you brought in today is that you're talking about that this is the beginning, I believe, of something which is almost like what is the word? Not a meta version of us or an alter ego, but I believe philosophically, we are creating a second version of us, which is like exists in the cloud. In the cloud, to deal with all this sort of decision fatigue that we have on a daily basis, right? We're creating the very, very early stages of it, and maybe, if you were to track the evolution of this in the future, that would be your singularity point, where actually that meta version becomes better than the real version. The real version just becomes like a husk, a physical husk.
So we're probably going to need to queue up the next show with this, because this is easily longer than an hour's conversation. But it's really funny how, without any, because as you say, we don't rehearse this show and I don't give you any prompts in advance, where you've got to with this conversation is exactly the journey that I am researching for a client right now, which is we've gone from voice, where we've got an artificial intelligent assistant who basically ends up making a lot of my shopping decisions for me. You've got to the situation there where marketing will become an algorithm talking to my algorithm. And there's a very real chance that that will happen. But in order for that to happen, it's going to have a vastly superior data set. And that data set isn't going to be one that we give a commercial entity like Google. It's going to probably sit on a personal, portable digital identity like a blockchain passport. Now, we talked about this and we got into all sorts of heated debates recently. So let's not go there right now. Let's save it for the next episode. But I think it is that idea of, it's very, very possible that everything that makes me, I could digitize and I could put into a tiny little system and I could send out into the universe. Now, the only thing that stops me living forever is the biological decomposition of my body.
The weak link.
Right. If I could synthesize my thought processes, which are electrical pulses, and my emotions, which are chemical reactions, if I could put that into an artificially intelligent system that relied on solar power, and used components that could either be easily replaced or wouldn't degrade over time, there is nothing to stop me becoming an entity that lives forever. Now, the question then becomes,
on the blockchain,
what's the point of life if you live forever? The funny thing about that is that I wouldn't procreate in the same way. And therefore,
but then like if you look at the markets, look at trading markets, effectively 90% of that is algorithms trading with algorithms. That's the market. As a being, as an entity. In the same way, you're talking about our life, that 90% of it might just be algorithms talking to algorithms. And then you have this weak link, which is the emotional, like that physical part.
It's the carbon.
The carbon. It
decays.
Exactly, which may, in the end up being a byproduct.
Yeah, and I think that I am one of those. I think if you put me in the Matrix as that movie,
is that where we're going?
I confess I would probably be the one in the tube going, no, really, just give me the steak that tastes like steak, because I don't see the benefit.
But then you're part of the.
I don't mind. Exactly. I am part of the system anyway. If we believe that we are some way unique and we're free of the confines of society and of our physical bodies, we're kidding ourselves. Now, I'm not suggesting that life is not a good thing, but I think that the way that we imagine life, we've conflated different things. What makes me is the pulses that go on inside my body.
This is, in artificial intelligence terms, you can define consciousness as an epiphenomena there you go, an epiphenomena.
That's your word of the day.
It is. Today is all about epiphenomena. An epiphenomena is like, so one of the big questions asking artificial intelligence, and again, we're over the time, but it's like what is consciousness? Because that's like, I'm a conscious being, therefore, this camera is not a conscious being, et cetera, et cetera. It can't think, even though my laptop can think in certain times. It's not conscious of the fact. It doesn't think, I'm a laptop. What defines consciousness? And there's this really interesting argument that consciousness is a byproduct. And that is because the computational power is so immense, and there's nothing like it. I mean, if you were to add all the machines in the world together, I don't think it would reflect one brain at this stage. But, it's just a curve, isn't it? If the computational power is so immense, it produces this epiphenomena, which is called consciousness, which is a byproduct, like a waste product, or in unglamorous terms, but it's like it exists in the same way that a computer hums. It has an electrical force field. That is consciousness. So it comes as a result of a very, very complex computational systems, and in the same way, it will come when the processes get more and more complex. So we're getting there.
We are, and I think just to wrap up where my brain goes with this, I think you mentioned earlier the ability to discuss philosophy with a system. if you think about where our brains go when we start thinking existentially and all that kind of stuff, it's fascinating because a lot of it is about hypotheses and imaginative original thought, but all of that is just bringing two existing things together in new ways. It's not going to be long before a system is capable of doing that. Whether it comes up with the same outcome as us is irrelevant. I think that's the bit, is that our biggest problem with our belief in AI creativity is that the AI at the moment is not capable of replicating creativity as we define it. But creativity is not about existing things. It's about creating something brand new. We've got to recognize that the AI can be creative. It just may not deliver things that we like or that we understand yet. And I think that's the really important bit. We've got to stop assuming that AI is going to behave like a human, because it won't. It's a completely different mechanism. The processes, the stimuli, all that kind of stuff are going to be used differently to create different kinds of outcomes. And I think that's the magic. We're not trying to replicate humans, because if we are, we will kill ourselves off as a species. The machines will do it better than us within 100 years, if not sooner. Why not create something that is distinct? And sure, it may be a superior being, but the good news is that superior being will not compete for anything with us. If it competes for energy, all it needs is solar power. Right? If you think about it, an artificial intelligence system, it only needs two things. It needs energy and it needs components. Those components are largely made of silicon at the moment, which we don't need to survive. And energy, Earth, as it sits at the moment, is not the best place in the universe for energy. If it's solar powered, it goes out into outer space and it gets better power. So the greatest danger that we have is that we become overly reliant on these systems. These systems.
But why does it need to be intelligent?
It doesn't. But why do we need to be intelligent? That happened through evolution. Does it need to survive is your question, and I think that's
that's its weak point. If it doesn't need to survive, it doesn't need to get better.
But does it matter to it if it doesn't need to survive? It doesn't matter if it dies. But does it? This is the important thing.
It does matter, because then it can't procreate. The only reason going back to your friend, it's like the only reason we're intelligent is so we can procreate.
Yeah.
So if I'm more intelligent, I can have a better chance than this guy over here.
And I think the existential question, and this is really profound existential questions.
Do it.
What does procreation do? What's the point of eternal human life?
There is none.
Right, and I think that's the point. Is if you gave a truly artificial...
It was a mistake.
If you give a truly artificial intelligence system a question of should life exist, it will get to the answer of there's no justification for it. That doesn't mean it should end.
Yeah.
So it's not going to kill us off. But it's just going to go and go, do you know what? We're just going to go and do our own thing over here. It will justify success and existence. If it doesn't need to procreate because it's going to live forever anyway, it just needs to replace its systems.
Well, it needs to replace its systems.
Does it, though? It might not. Because if it's out in outer space, it doesn't degrade.
Well, it does. Everything goes to entropy.
We think. But it may not.
Well,
and
you're
also,
redefining physics.
No, but I think that the point is that if I can replace a component based on...
Nothing lasts forever.
But you can find new components, right?
Right.
I mean, all it needs is a little bit of silicon and a little bit of energy.
That's procreation, though.
If I get a bionic limb, is that procreation? I think this is the important bit. If it's the same...
But that bionic limb will soon degrade for entropy, the law of entropy.
This is where I go back to what makes me is what happens inside here.
Yeah.
You could replace my entire body.
Oh, well, yeah, again, you can replace your cell for cell. You can replace your...
And that's the magic.
Yeah, would it still be you?
And if
you take the epiphenomena argument, yes.
Yeah, and I think that's the beauty, is that if it is simply the electronic pulses and the processes that define the organism, it's not even an organism, is it? The artificial organism.
Yeah, entity.
If it can completely reorganize itself, but the underlying process and thought patterns remain the same, it can live forever. That's why I said it's probably another show's worth.
It is. All right. Well, we've had a really interesting discussion. We started off talking about, it's really the same discussion, because it's basically taking it to the extreme, isn't it? We started off talking about voice control. Then we looked at artificial intelligence and pattern recognition. And also we looked at the Google example and, why we needed voice control. And we talked about some of the examples of why we need voice control. And where that goes, if these voice assistants like Google Home and Alexa become what you're sort of suggesting, like these beings, these entities that can do all these things for us and know us better than ourselves, we're investing a lot of our personality and our lives into these things, and therefore, the more existential question that has come up is that what does that then do for us as a human being, as a species? So what starts with the innocent thing that you sit on your mantelpiece ends with the human being, the race of Homo sapiens being annihilated or replaced.
It's not going to happen
by silicon-based life forms.
To leave people on a high note, what's most likely to happen is that all of the dull, boring, irrelevant decisions we make in day-to-day life, we will outsource to a machine, and we will free ourselves to focus on the things that we really enjoy, whether it's a hobby, whether it's whatever it may be. Out in the wilderness exploring, we will need to waste less time doing the crap we don't care about because the machines will do it for us. So I'm optimistic.
Yeah, I am as well. I'm optimistic. I'm on the side of the machines as well. So I'm one of them, my new machine overlords. There you go. So very interesting conversation, and you can get Simon's report.
Which doesn't quite give that level of detail of the future. But
yours is an imperative for what comes in the next 100 years.
It is. It's the stepping stones towards the future.
All right. And where do we get your report, Simon?
So you can find it at kepios.com/data, where you will find 7 years worth of data collection and reporting, thousands of charts worth of data. So kepios.com/data.
Yeah.
And you'll find me on the social webs as Simon Kemp, obviously. But if you're on Twitter, you'll find me as Eskimon.
Yeah. So if you have any feedback from today's existential discussion, then ping Simon, let him know.
Let's have a conversation about this.
Yeah, and if you're watching on YouTube as well, then you can also leave a comment in the comment box below, feedback, and if you like it, hit the like button in the face. Subscribe to this channel if you want more of this in terms of existential discussion, carbon-based life forms versus silicon-based life forms, but more experts like Simon coming your way. This is Graham Brown and Simon Kemp in the Age of Tech podcast studio, wishing you a very happy day. Enjoy, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks for joining us.